Okay, so now that we have movement and a working camera with relative movement and everything regarding that, I think the next logical thing is to make a health system. I was thinking about also potentially making some enemies. We'll see if we get to that today. Maybe I'll just make some like stage hazards, things like spikes and stuff, to test the HP values out on. I'm not entirely sure. First things first though, let's make a new script called player health. And here, do we want to have health be counted in integers or in floats is the question. Like, will the damage calculations, it's probably best to do it in floats, right? We'll display rounded integers, but I think we should probably do all the calculation in floats. So for now we have a float for max HP and a float for HP. For the time being, we're going to just set at start HP equals max HP. Eventually, we'll probably end up changing this around because this way it always sets you to max HP at the start of any given scene, which I don't think is long-term what we're going to want, but for now, it'll do. Same with this, we're going to give it a default value of 100. We'll change that around when we get to it. And we don't really need the update method, I don't think. So this is all we're going to need for the time being. So now we've got 100 HP. That took me 15 fucking minutes. Way longer than it should realistically take. But we're there. We're there. Then let's make a public void damage with a float parameter. Then we do HP minus damage, minus equals damage, that is. HP is less than 0. We set the HP back to 0 just because we don't want to display anything less. And then for now, let's just reload the scene. So we need to be using Unity Engine scene management. And we have scene manager dot load scene, and we get scene manager dot get active scene, and that needs to be a string, right? Alright, let's add a little something. A 3D object. Do we have something like a something pointy? I don't think we've got anything pointy, so for the time being we're just going to stick with the cube. Alright, so now I have to think about how this is going to end up working in the end. I probably want this script to house most of my enemy behavior and not just instructions to damage the player on that script by itself. I mean, it doesn't matter that much in the whole scheme of things, I guess. But just for naming purposes, if I'm going to stick with this and improve this script to include a lot more enemy behavior, I probably want to like name it properly, right? I'm going to regret calling it this, but I'm going to call it enemy, which is probably not a good idea. Let's make an attack method here, just so that I can reference this whatever and wherever we are. For the time being, this is going to trigger when we hit the collider, but eventually, of course, this is going to just being attack. We shouldn't call it attack in that case, should we? We should call it damage player, because we're going to also have an attack method, most likely. That's actually going to do the attack and like check whether or not we're in range or maybe we're defending or whatever, right? And then only if those checks pass, we get into this method, which we're making now, which is damage player. We need the player health. Eventually we'll also need like player position and stuff like that, but for the time being, that is everything we need. Okay, since we have a absolute fuck ton of enemies in theory walking around at the end of this, I want them to automatically find the player on start, so I don't have to manually deal with having to put in variables. This way I can also spawn in enemies and they can just find the player and know what player health is. The reason I give them this information to begin with and not just when they're hitting me, because that could be very well a thing, is number one, I didn't think about it, and number two, if they have this information readily available to begin with, I could potentially, if I wanted to in the future, make something where they get less aggressive as you are lower on HP. So if you're at your last like 10% of HP, I could make their trigger range a little bit lower, or I could make them deal a little bit less damage or whatever. And dealing less damage would be possible regardless, but actually influencing their behavior based on your HP, they will need to just have that information readily available. So that's the main reason I'm doing it this way. I don't know if I'm going to make use of this. I plan to, but I might not. This is also related to what I said before, where I said we're probably going to need a get HP method anyway, because most likely the enemy will in some way or another end up making use of it to have a little bit more dynamic difficulty. Anyway, now that we have the player HP in the enemy, we can simply damage player, and we can say player HP dot damage, and now we probably want to have we can serialize field this one float. Let's just call it damage. Why not? For the time being, that's everything we need. We might end up in the far-flung future giving this more than just that. Something like... Actually, we probably don't really need that much more in this specific method, honestly. Because even if we do something like fire or poison damage or whatever, that's probably going to be part of this method over here, I imagine. So let's do on collision, enter. So now when we collide, we're going to set a variable for player health, which we get from the collision object, which is going to be the player. In theory, could be anything else, but if it doesn't have the player health script attached to it, the rest of the script will not run. If it would, we'd probably end up with some errors. So we first check whether or not the thing that we're damaging actually has something to damage, which is the player health script. And since we're going to not have all of the damaging always done through just collision, we're going to have an attack, and maybe some things will be through collision, and maybe some things will be through like projectiles and stuff like that. Just having all of that within one method that we can reference rather than having to duplicate this one line of code like 5 times. Maybe this one line of code is going to be like 10 lines of code eventually, so, you know, it just keeps things readable and efficient. So let's damage player when we collide, and this in theory should... Let's say our damage by default here is like maybe 10. That should be everything we need. Of course, we're going to want to add a little bit of knockback when we get damage too, but for the time being, this does the trick. Every time we run into this, we get a little bit of damage. I don't know why I am tuning. That is... very, very interesting indeed. How the hell? Why does that happen? That has to be because I am moving ever so slightly, right? Let's see, speed. Yeah, I'm moving ever so slightly, which means that I'm also rotating. Probably a good idea to make it so that I have to be moving a certain speed for the rotation to take effect, because this is always gonna happen. That's just how physics works. Running into something is probably going to move me around, but if it's moving me around, it definitely should be... We'll think about that later. So, next thing I want to test is if I run into it again, it should reset the scene. It doesn't, because the scene is not included in the build settings yet. That makes a lot of sense. Actually, it is. So why in the world am I getting an error here? Maybe if we try to load it through build index rather than scene name, that'll do the trick. You never know. Could be, right? Could very well be the case. Probably not going to help, but it's worth checking before we dive into this rabbit hole any further. Because this could take a while to figure out. Yep, no, that fixes it. Grand. Amazing. It's probably because it's looking for something like outdoor scene. But what the function returns is probably something like scene.outdoor scene or something like that, and that's why it's not working. But now that we have the build index as the driving factor there, that's all right. So we've got our damaging thing going on. All right, so I've changed this around now to say instead of what it said before, which is just check if the movement direction is not equal to 0. Now it's checking if the magnitude of the movement is more than 0.05, meaning that it has to be moving a certain speed in order for the rotation to be changed as well. Is that a slightly hacky way of fixing things? It fucking might be, but seems like it's working. So actually, it's not. Not yet anyway. So I don't actually know that it was the fact that I was moving around. I think it was actually spinning around a rigid body. So let's put this back to the way it was for a moment. And now that I've locked the rotation around the y-axis for the rigid body, I think that actually fixes my problem as is. Which means that the problem I was trying to fix just didn't exist. Definitely seems like that is the case based on everything going on here. Okay, that's good. Now, we can go back to making things that hurt us, which is just so much fun. We're going to change this player health to player stats. I'm doing that now before it's referenced in a lot of different places, because this is going to fuck up some of our code. Because in enemy, we need to change this to player stats. At least in theory, that's how that works. Oh, this needs to be changed as well. That makes sense. So now that we've saved that, this should all work and everything should be fine now. The reason I'm doing that is because things like defense stats, maybe eventually like magic or attack stats, probably all going to be stored in there as well. Specifically because the defense is going to affect how much damage we take. Alright, everything works as it should. Let's make a defense potion, shall we? So eventually this is probably going to be a much more complicated formula than it is right now. But for the time being, we're going to do damage minus defense. Which means that if our defense is actually higher than the damage that's dealt to us, we're healing. Which is definitely not something we want to do. I'm just going to leave that alone for the time being. But that definitely is something that we do need to fix. And let's give this thing a different material as well, because I keep losing it in the background. It's just doesn't look that good. And now I have a cylinder, which we're going to give a script called, let's just call it potion. So on collision enter, we do the same thing. Variable player stats equals collision get component player stats. Collision game object get component player stats is of course what I meant. And then we do a if player stats, we don't need the is not equal to null, that's implied. Then destroy this game object. That's the very last step we're going to do, because everything has to happen before it gets destroyed, obviously. We make a serialized field for the defense value. We go player set defense with our defense. I do realize that we probably actually, instead of, that's the wrong class, we probably want to not have it equals, but plus equals, so that if we take up multiple potions, it stacks. And then we probably also want to have a float for duration. We're not going to use that right away, so I'm just going to set that to actually to a variable, just so that we can use that in the future and have it like after like a minute take away that same defense value again. So now if we set this defense potion to 5 and we go to damage ourselves, oh no, we got hit twice. We also need iframes. By 10 every time. Now we pick this up and our damage is, you can very shortly see, oh, the reason we can damage twice is because our goddamn nose, I think. But let's get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. We know that our directional stuff is working. That being said, we wouldn't have known that it wasn't working if we didn't have the nose. So yeah, that definitely it was the nose. So now if we pick this up and we run into this, yeah, the corner still double damages. Again, we definitely need invincibility frames, but this for the time being works. And now if we, this is the real fun bit. Now if we copy this and we make 2 of these, we can damage ourselves for 10. Then we pick one of these up, we damage ourselves for 5. We pick the other one up, and now we don't get damaged at all anymore. Now, the exploit, or just straight up bug, depending on how you want to classify things, comes in where you pick up 3 of these little things, and now this thing is actually healing us, which we definitely don't want that to be the case. So let's see if there's like a quick and easy fix for that. That is simply another if statement, I suppose. So if damage is greater than defense, then we do all this, and otherwise we don't do anything. So now if we pick up all of these, we still should get no healing, right? Yeah, okay, so that's easily fixed. That's the HP and damage system for the time being. I think we're gonna leave it at that for the time being. We've made a little bit more progress. We've got something going, and I don't know what we're gonna do next, because I am still not eager to look into making enemies. I don't think it's that difficult, but I think it's the next logical step is making some enemies. So let's get to that.